The resurrection of Jesus is not just a promise of eternal life. The resurrection of Jesus is power for living today. It's not an easy message, a Pollyanna-like simple message. It's a message that has to begin where our story does today, with nothing less than death and with deep and real grief. I think it's ironic that Easter morning in John's Gospel begins the way it does, with such darkness and with tears and with an abject lack of hope. The good news of Easter is experienced most fully, I think, by those who have suffered, faced hopelessness, and in it have encountered Christ and His promise. I was talking with a friend this morning who lost his father this year, and this Easter he hears in a completely brand new way. Mary is about to get an encounter like that will change her life. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene, by herself, alone, makes her way to the tomb before dawn. The women don't need to anoint the body. According to John's Gospel, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, two religious leaders, took the body of Jesus down and anointed it with about 100 pounds of spices as they buried him in the tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea. If you remember the story, if you were here on Good Friday, you heard that Mary was there, Mary of Magdala. She saw where the tomb was. She saw what happened on the cross. And on Sunday morning, before anyone else is awake, she makes her way, remembering where it was. She couldn't go there on the Sabbath, so she had to wait in the Jewish calendar to the third day, Sunday morning. At the first opportunity, she returns to the tomb. Now, she has to overcome some darkness, both darkness in a very real scale in terms of pre-dawn light, and also the darkness that she carries inside of her. Not only was it dark before the sun had come up, and they didn't have ever-ready batteries in those days, but something more simple, but she was also fighting back deep grief, a deep darkness that she carried. She's grieving because her master is dead, murdered in a horrible public execution. And she doesn't just bring grief, though, to the tomb. A part of her tears, I think, are linked to some lingering fears about herself. She has to overcome these fears about herself. It's a dark world. There's a lot to worry about in the dark world. You just watch the news for a half an hour and you know how dark it can be. But there's also darkness in her soul. She has to face outer darkness. There's a guard posted at the tomb. Will they mistreat her when she arrives there? But her devotion pushes her beyond that fear. Would the authorities be trying to round up all the radical followers of this teacher, Jesus, who's been executed on that Friday and now are being sought out themselves? But she needs to be near him, even if it's just his tomb. You see, Jesus had liberated her from her inner darkness in his earthly ministry. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Mary Magdalene was among the women that supported Jesus from Galilee, and that Mary had identified her only in this way, no matter what church's tradition has done, that she was a woman that was delivered from demonic possession. It says that she had 7 demons possessing her. Perhaps she's worried that her life will descend into that kind of chaos again. He had set her free once and became the hope for her life, but now he's dead and buried. And she goes to the only source she knows for healing and stability, which in this case is a tomb. Mary had to face those kind of fears. She carried that still within her. I'm sure she hadn't forgotten. His earthly ministry was only 3 years. How could she forget the kind of chaos? Fears are real things. Fears have a tremendous hold on us, don't they? Think about the place your fears are. Mary needed to be near the source of strength to face her fears, the source that freed her from those fears. So she cast all of her other fears for safety aside to go to the tomb early on that morning. Fears do funny things to us, don't they? If you're a kid, you know that there's always some kind of boogeyman in the closet. The darkness is for real. If you're an adult, you don't get too far beyond that. They make us unreasonable oftentimes. They convince us of things that just simply aren't true. I read some statistics this week about strange facts about fear and death. And let me gauge your fear factor with these questions. Which is more dangerous? Airline crashes or donkeys? Which is more dangerous to you personally? Donkeys. Donkeys kill more people annually than airline crashes. Hard to believe. Which is more dangerous, sharks or coconuts? Oh, you're catching on and cheating already. You're right. Coconuts kill about 150 people a year. Sharks don't kill nearly that number, even though it's funny when you get hit with a coconut. It's not so funny when you get attacked by a shark. But it's not funny if the coconut is fatal. What's more dangerous? Stop cheating. What do you really think? Champagne corks or poisonous spiders? Spiders, of course, they're ooey and it creates all kinds of arachnophobic stuff. No, you are more likely to be killed from an errant champagne cork, watch yourself on this next New Year's Eve, than you are to be killed by a poisonous spider. Fears control us. Fears make us unreasonable. Fears bind our life. Fears set a tenor and a ceiling above which we will not rise until we face them. And Mary is walking to the tomb with a whole lot of fears haunting her, the remembrance of a chaos unleashed within her that she could not control and she could not manage and she could not make it through. And her only source of hope is lying in that tomb. And she's blinded by her fears when she goes to that Easter morning. It's fascinating how blind she is. She gets a vision of angels. Did you notice it in the reading? She had a vision of angels, and she completely disregards it. They said, "What are you looking for?" Angels. They moved him. Where did they put him? And she turns away from them. And then she turns and meets what she thinks is a gardener, mow, blow, and go guy, who says, "What are you doing here so early? What are you looking for?" And she's desperate, like anyone who's desperate for a loved one that they cannot find. "Where have you put him? I'll give him to me. I'll take him away. He won't be any more problem to you. Please." One last indignity in this public execution, I guess, is what Mary has convinced herself of. The fear that execution is more real than what is about to burst upon her. When the mow, blow, and go guy says, in a voice that's so familiar to her, it finally wakes her up, "Mary." That's when Easter began for us. Easter begins when Mary can see clearly. Easter literally began when Jesus rose from the dead, but we don't know anything about that. Nobody's told us anything about that. All we know is when the witnesses appear and when he speaks her name with that familiar voice and awakens her. God calls us by name. It's always intensely personal. Though it may not be a voice that we can understand, it may not be a voice often that we hear, and oftentimes our ears are attuned to hear other things in the world instead of the voice of God. But Mary can attest to you that God calls us by name. And when you hear it, that's when Easter begins. As it did for Mary, so does it for you. It's not unique for her. Fear and pain and real suffering can get the best of us. Who's here with that kind of reality in their life today? Don't put your hand up. But the Easter encounter with Jesus reminds us through the story of Mary that death does not have a final word, and therefore fear doesn't have to have the final word. Jesus came from the tomb on broken feet. Remember when he encounters his disciples, his wrists are still nail-pierced. and so's his side spear-pierced, which means he's broken and walking on these feet. He walks on broken feet into the sunrise of a new day, into the sunrise of a new way of life. His body still bearing on it the symbols of his suffering and his grief. But now, suffering and grief have been vanquished into new life. In the same way, Mary's suffering and pain and good as dead fears have been vanquished in new life and new purpose. Easter calls her name. Easter calls your name, and you come to encounter Christ on this Sunday. You know that your suffering, your pain, your deadened life can meet on this day in front of an empty tomb new meaning, new hope, new purpose, new life in Christ. That's what Easter wants you to see in this encounter, and it wants to give you in exchange your fear for his hope. It's striking to me that the only gospel that mentions this is the Gospel of John, that this encounter takes place in a garden. We don't hear that in any other gospels, that the tomb is actually in a garden, which I think is kind of interesting because gardens are always an interesting place in the Bible. Do you know any other garden that the Bible mentions? Eden. Do you remember what happened in Eden? We got booted. You've been booted out, humanly speaking, out of better places than when you've been booted out because you were booted out of Eden. And now we're back in a garden. John is making a point that what was undone in the brokenness of the garden, that first one, is being recreated in this new garden through an empty tomb and a living Lord. No longer is she in bondage. She was freed once by Jesus, and now she's made completely free because death has been overturned, just as it was for Adam and Eve. Notice, too, then, that Mary is also sent. On Easter morning, there's an awful lot of running in John's Gospel. I don't know if you noticed it. And there's guys wrote it because they were competing with each other. John, the beloved disciple, who's writing? I got there first. Peter came later and, of course, pushed his way in. But I was also the first to believe. John is telling of himself. But the first one to be sent, the first one to be commissioned, the first one to be actually called in the resurrection is not one of the 12. It's not one of the guys. This isn't an old boys club. This is first century Israel, the Middle East, Beeker. The first one to be changed from a disciple to apostle. Disciple means one who follows. Apostle means one who's sent. Is Mary Magdalene. The invitation throughout the Gospel of John is to come and see. Over and over we hear this line repeated. It's the call to discipleship, the call to come to Christ and to learn from him, to take from this teacher what we need to learn about this life and how to be empowered for here and now. And then Jesus tells her to go and tell. Come and see, go and tell. That's the apostolic charge, to go and tell. The disciple follows her teacher, but this disciple is now an apostle who's sent on a mission, and it changes her life. Her fears are overturned by the presence of Christ, and she gets to rehearse how her fears can be overturned every time she talks about her encounter with Jesus, as she says to the disciples later, I have seen the risen Lord. Mary's grief is overturned. Not by evidence of an empty tomb, not by evidence that Jesus is in heaven as some spiritual being, but by the very physical presence of Christ. Her fears overturned in the knowledge that death can no longer hold him, the source of her hope, and therefore she is completely secured forever. And now he sends her to be a part of his mission in the world. He knows there's not going to be any better witness to the power of the resurrection than a person that he has risen from the dead twice. Mary in her healing, and Mary from her grief and fear. Is there any better witness than someone who's actually walked that way? Eric Butterworth tells a story about a young soldier who lost his legs in battle. Something died within this young man and when he found out that he was never going to be able to walk again. He lay on the hospital bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. He refused to talk to anyone who tried to help. He refused to cooperate with doctors and nurses, anybody who tried to adjust him or move him forward. One day, another patient in the hospital happened to stroll by, and he sat down in the chair next to the soldier that was lying in the bed, and he drew out a harmonica, and he began to play very softly. The patient turned around and looked at him over his shoulder, then looked back toward the opposing wall. That was all for that day, just a simple tune, and the man got up and walked away. The next day, the harmonica player came back. And for the next several days, he came back and he would play a tune, maybe two. And one day, after many days of playing, the harmonica player said to the man lying in the bed, does my playing annoy you? The patient finally said, no, I kind of like it. And they began to talk a little bit more each day. One day the harmonica player was in sort of a jovial mood, and so he played a sprightly tune on his harmonica, and he began to tap dance right there by the bed. The soldier looked at him, apparently unimpressed, and he said, hey, why don't you smile once in a while? The world needs to know that you're alive. That's what the dancer was saying to the man in the bed. But the legless soldier said, I might as well be dead for the fix that I'm in. Okay, said his happy friend, so you're dead. But you're not as dead as the fellow who was crucified 2,000 years ago, and he came out all right. Oh, it's easy for you to preach, the young soldier said. But if you were in my fix, you'd sing a different tune. Resurrection's kind of a far-off hope for me. The harmonica player stopped and said, I know a 2,000-year-old resurrection is pretty far in the dim past, so maybe an up-to-date example will help you believe that you can rise from the dead. And with that, the man pulled back the legs of his trousers, exposing two artificial limbs. The day that Jesus called Mary's name is the day that she rose again from the dead. The day that that man was able to link his legless body to new hope was the day that his comrade began the journey to new life. Don't make Easter into a glib, glad, happy, Pollyanna sort of thing, because Easter comes through real pain and real suffering in people's lives. And those of us who've walked those journeys with Mary understand the profound message when he calls our name and the profound hope that is represented in that voice calling us. Her resurrection began the morning when Jesus spoke her name and she embraced him. I think that's that cryptic message that about Jesus not ascending. I think it's that she had him in a bear hug of a vice. Now imagine if you've lost someone, what would be your reaction to seeing them again for the first time? I can tell you, it'd be hard to get me off of him. And I think Mary holds on to him because she knows in him she is completely free again. And now free to do his work in the world, sent on a mission. And so are you. To go to people like that soldier who has lost all hope and to remind them that there is hope in the resurrection. To go to that hopeless teenager who doesn't see any possibility of a future with the hope that God continues to infuse into this world a hope that is beyond circumstances. It is to go to the bedside of a grieving mother or a father or wife or grandson and to speak words of hope again, not glib words, words that come through real pain, that speak a real message of a God who doesn't let death be the final word. We've been in a series of stories in John's Gospel in our congregation talking about encounters with Christ, and each week we've looked at various people and how the encounter with Christ has changed them. We looked at the competent insider, the complete outsider. We've looked at the blind man who can now see. We've seen the grieving sisters, and all of which these portraits have painted a picture of how the encounter with Christ has changed them. I hope you can see at least some of the darkness in yourself, in the darkness that Mary Magdalene bears that morning. Maybe you're bound by grief or by fear. Maybe you've been released by hope or empowered by living love. What if your darkness and what if your fears cannot overcome Christ's presence and his love? What if, as the gospel says, love is greater? If death cannot keep him from those that he loves, neither can the tombs of our doubts, neither can the tombs of our fears, neither can the tombs of our darkness. He loves us that much. And that's the power of the cross and resurrection. Easter is an encounter with the living Lord. Our fears and our worries vanished. Hopes restored. New life has come. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah. Let's stand and we'll sing as we get our worship team